before we start, I'd just like to take another quick vote, a little bit like yesterday. If you're optimistic about the world successfully tackling the environmental challenges, particularly climate change, could you raise your hand, please? If you're optimistic. That's very worrying. And if you're pessimistic, I guess that includes most people here. Okay. Well, we'll take the vote again at the end, and we'll see if there's much change from our optimistic panel, I'm sure. When I was first asked to do this this discussion, I noticed the phrase "moving beyond Copenhagen." It sounded to me a little bit like therapy. Before we can come up with the positive ideas, we need to spend a little bit of time going over what happened, and a little bit like a love affair that went wrong. We're in therapy right now after Copenhagen, and we need to move on. And I'd like to very, very briefly introduce the panel. I've got a complete football team here behind me. You'll know from yesterday, Niels Petersen, former Danish Foreign Minister and Environment Minister, I believe. No, not at all. Okay, Foreign Minister, that was it. Okay, and economics, sorry. And Jan-Erike, who gave the speech just before us, Defense Minister from Finland, Environment Minister, and... Okay, thank you. And Jøregensen, who gave a very, slightly depressing speech, I thought, earlier on, and I'm hoping maybe that we can come up with some more positive ideas. Basically involved not just at the Danish political level, but also in the European Parliament for Environmental Affairs. Somebody who comes from, has spent some considerable amount of time in my home area of Sussex, actually. I believe you studied there, and also in the Dutch Parliament, and concerned with economics and environmental affairs. I'm delighted also to have Madame Dominique Voynet, former French Environment Minister, member of Amnesty International, and I believe one of the founders of Greenpeace 20 years ago. It still counts. Yeah. And we're deeply honored also to have Ambassador Makaese Nyaphisi. I really hope I've pronounced your name correctly. I think I should call you Ambassador for the discussion. It's probably safer. As well as being ambassador for Lesotho to Germany, we are absolutely honored to have you here because you were representing the LDC countries at the Copenhagen discussion. So we are hoping for some inside gossip and background to the Copenhagen summit. And lastly, we have Professor Dr. Lufter Xhuveli. I put the difficult to pronounce people right on this side here, but. A distinguished Albanian politician and economist who also was leader of the Environmentalist Agrarian Party, and I hope to get some background regarding not just the environment but also food policy, which I believe is connected with this. Moving beyond Copenhagen, before we get to some practical ideas and solutions, because I know Mark is very keen to have practical solutions and ideas to some of the challenges we face, I think we do have to have a bit of post-Copenhagen therapy. And if I could ask the ambassador, first of all, it strikes me that one of the problems with such events is that they are events. There is so much pressure built up into a short period of time. Would it not be better maybe to have a permanent process, a permanent organization? Because I'm slightly concerned that maybe in Mexico, we will have the same problem. We will have a window of opportunity, and it will be difficult to get everybody's agreement on time. So with the benefit of your experience there, maybe you could tackle this issue and whether there is a better way maybe of reaching agreement globally after Copenhagen.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. To the point, I think it is important that the process of negotiating, discussing climate change should be on the agenda. Everybody else knows the consequence of climate change. We know the impacts. We know the consequences, both economic, political, and otherwise. So the process and the institutions are in place. For instance, these are negotiated under the United Nations Framework for Convention on Climate Change. That is a very, very important mechanism for discussing this. Secondly, the challenge has been when you have got more than 190 countries over 2 weeks trying to reach a deal, it is almost impossible, if not difficult. So one must recognize that when you have got 192 countries sitting down together trying to reach an agreement, it's not an easy thing. It is not an easy task at all. So that should not be undermined. But all these countries have agreed that they recognize the importance of addressing climate change. They are absolutely unanimous on the fact that it must be discussed and negotiated. They all agree. The difference lies in this. What should each and every one of those countries actually do in terms of committing themselves to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, both individually as a countries and bloc? But even at that, they've just almost sort of agreed because the baselines have been there during the, in the Kyoto Protocol. And then the process of negotiating are there on those two tracks. The challenge becomes economic, the financial aspect of it. Finance is the biggest issue. Who is going to pay for the finances for mitigation and for adaptation? These are the really crucial issues. And this affects mostly the Annex 1 parties. This is then further compounded by the fact that some emerging countries like China, Brazil, South Africa, who contribute a lot to greenhouse gas emissions, are not, by virtue of not being Annex 1 countries, supposed to come up and put their figures on the table, and yet still being able to want to get financing for mitigation and adaptation. That is the problem. I believe then in conclusion that whatever has come out of Copenhagen, the accord, is a beginning, a right step in the right direction. Over the next 1 year, there are going to be initiatives and meetings that are going to be held, and with Germany taking the lead, for instance, and President Sarkozy and the rest of them in May, and there are going to be some meetings I believe in Paris in April. I think all the countries, including those countries that are in Annex 1 parties, agreed that in Mexico, by that time, there has to be an agreement which is fair, which is binding, with ambitious targets. I think that those three things, they will try and address those, and are committed to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. When I first studied politics, the first lesson, the lecturer said, politics is about who gets the money and how much. This is the first, and who gets to pay as well. So we have a number of people with governmental experience on the panel. I thought your answer was very eloquent, but when it comes down to it, it is a question of finance. Who gets to pay and how much? And maybe I'd like to throw this open to members of the panel who were formerly in the government. Is there a way that we can make this financial cost binding on the countries who we know which will have to pay? Because somebody will have to pay for this. We know the rough amount. We know that it could be as little as 0.5% of world GDP. So how can we develop a system which will be able to get the requisite money and from the countries who we know will have to pay for this? Could I offer this open to maybe Mr. Petersen?
Thank you very much. Before addressing that, I would like to say that one mistake about Copenhagen was there was too much hype beforehand. Expectations ran too high, supported by, very naturally, that politicians felt that this is very popular to say that we should reach an agreement in Copenhagen, and so everybody began saying this. The American president, the UK prime minister, the Danish government, UN bodies, everybody wanted to to play up Copenhagen. Of course, this is very legitimate because that puts pressure on governments. But on the other hand, there was too much hype. But that's my assessment of it, and this was true also before the whole thing started. Would have been more wise to play down expectations and reach some results. Now, as to how will the money come about, I think the biggest problem really here, if I look at it from point of view of an economics minister or finance minister, is not to come up with the money, but come up with new money. What they will do, the ministers of finance, is mostly they will take old money and put into the new basket and save money on development assistance and use it for climate change. So additional money is difficult. And ministers of finance, particularly in situations like this where they need money, they will juggle around with the sums and try to get it on the cheap. I think that's the big difficulties. But of course, the cultural differences here. We've seen many times countries committing to pay, and when we 1 year and a half later we see who did they pay? They didn't. And there has to be a political will on part of the country really to live up to their responsibilities, and that must be followed therefore very closely by press, by NGOs pressing on to have governments fulfill their obligations.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, we all know that France and America have a very special relationship, sometimes cooler, sometimes a little bit warmer. It strikes me that we have a panel of an audience which is understanding of the issue of climate change and very proactive. But one of the problems is we can do a lot in Europe, and we have done a lot. But if certain countries do not sign up to this accord, then it probably doesn't count for that much. And I'd like to open this over to you here as a representative of France on the panel. Wouldn't it be better maybe for the EU to pressure maybe America? I mean, how about, for example, a green free trade area that countries which sign up to various climate accords we trade with, and that we incentivize countries to improve their environmental record. Otherwise, there are penalties to pay.
Thank you. Well, first, I'm not an activist of Amnesty International. I've been a member, a little member 30 years ago, and but I've been the French negotiator in Kyoto with Das Mädchen, Angela Merkel at the time. So I can say a lot about that and the way we could discuss, because our chiefs of state and of governments did not take in consideration the economical impacts of our commitments in Kyoto. They allowed the environment ministers to take their decisions alone. They would not have done this if they had understood the consequences, I think. I want also to answer a question you asked, Mr. Ambassador. Do we need a World Environment Organization? Of course. Of course. Is it enough to face an issue like climate change? Of course not. For me, it's a question that should be addressed by the plenary of the United Nations sessions, because it has impacts on all the human activities in all the sectors and in all the countries. It's not like excluding some persistent pollutants where you have only 100 or 1,000 firms across the world producing this molecule. It's a question of 7 billion people having to coordinate their efforts, and so it's for a plenary session, I think. What about Europe? I agree totally with what has been said concerning the fact that we had too high expectations. But I don't agree with you when you say we have done a lot. We did not. We spoke a lot. But we did not act so much. And so we were so convinced of our strong credibility. We were so convinced to be the ones and the only ones who could make the link between G77 countries and China and the big emitters like US, that we did not see how things were going on. We did not see the potential rise of emerging nations. We did not understand what could really be asked or hoped with the election of Barack Obama. We did not understand that it would allow most of the countries to give the priority to bilateral discussions. And it was perfect for the United States because they don't like to take commitments in a multilateral frame. They accept to make big efforts, and so did they in the field of climate change, in the cities, in the states, but they did not want to be committed on the multilateral level. And Europe is the first victim, I think, of the Copenhagen discussions. The United Nations system is the second one, and of course also the little states, islands, and so on. So, what's the place of France in this? We have a very selfish, prominent president. So, well, I think he thinks it. He's convinced of it. So, he is very proud of what we have called the Grenelle process. It's a system of negotiation, of dialogue between all the stakeholders, the banks, the assurances, the firms, the trade unions, the farmers, the consumers, all the citizens and associations and so on. But it hasn't produced a lot. Laws, rules, but not fresh money, but not mobilization of a civil society. And so I think the place of France is to take in consideration that she has to change the way of negotiating. France is not in situation to tell others what they should do, and I think it's a moment to be more modest and more cooperative in a European way.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, if France is going to be modest, which is it's new, yes, but welcome. And Europe did not live up to its promise, and the United Nations and smaller countries also were the losers of the process. Who will drive this process forward? I'd like to now maybe get some positive ideas in this regarding maybe business incentives for this, and I may pass over to Mr. Jøregensen, because I have the feeling that, and from the discussions earlier today, that maybe the wrong business incentives are currently underway. I mean, do we really need to spend billions on subsidies for solar panel from northern Germany? I mean, anybody who's been to northern Germany knows it's possibly the worst place to look for sun if you're really... So, I mean, is there a case of having maybe global business incentives? I mean, could the solar panel and the solar energy from North Africa be better harnessed?
Yes, well, I think, generally speaking, you need to solve one problem, and that is if you put restrictions on emissions in one country or one group of countries, then how do you make sure that that then doesn't just mean that the industry will move? If production costs increase, then why shouldn't the industry just move? The atmosphere doesn't care where the emissions take place, so we don't solve the problem if that happens. Now, the way we've solved this internally in the European Union is by creating an emission trading system. Now, we have decided to reduce our emissions by 20%, as I said. One part of that needs to be done by putting pressure on industry. Another part is non-ETS. That's agriculture, transportation, housings. That's the job of the national governments. But the ETS That's not the job of the national government. The ETS is a common European goal. So for industry in Europe, we have one common goal of reduction in emissions. And Denmark is not more progressive than Germany. Germany is not more progressive than Spain. We all have the same goal. And if we didn't have the same goal, then we would probably see that industry will move to the countries that had the least ambitious goals. Now, what happens is from 2013, we will simply cut the number of allowances every year. So all of the industry in Europe knows that every year they need to be 1.79% more energy efficient, or produce 1.7% less goods if they can't be efficient. What we've done to make this also an incentive-creating mechanism is that a part of the allowances, 20% of the allowances, are to be auctioned. And then, in the end, 100%, but we start by 20%. This means that if you change the way you produce into a more sustainable way before you actually have to do it, then you have some allowances that you can sell and auction. And then you can use the revenue to finance your reform of production. This is a way of using a market mechanism to have a more sustainable production. Perfect. Problem is, if we only do it in Europe, they'll move to Asia. That's why we need one of two things. Best would, of course, be if we could have a global emission trading system, or at least systems that can be linked. If we don't get that, then we'll have border taxes. Border taxes on products produced in countries that don't have the same targets. There are no other possibilities. So this is also going to be an extremely important part of the process towards Mexico. It's something that's not discussed very often in the public because it's a little bit complicated, but really it's one of the most important things. And the US are already incorporating this and also in their legislation. They're going to have a cap and trade system also, as we have in the EU, and we might be able to connect them. We're pretty close to actually seeing how this can be done. And this is an example of the European Union using soft power. The power that you get when you create institutions that others then recreate. We haven't told any nation that we will bomb them or give them, or they will have any economic punishment if they don't do this. They do it because we have set the example. So this is also one way of EU to show leadership. Obviously, we don't know yet whether it will work or not, but we're definitely getting closer.
Okay, some positive thoughts there, but will it actually work if you have the European Union and America constructing different systems, the cap and trade system?
What we need is it doesn't really matter if they're different systems. What matters is whether or not we will, let me put it a completely different way. We're doing this to put a price on carbon. A global price on carbon. And one way of the European system now interacting with other parts of the world is what I mentioned earlier as the flexible mechanism. Instead of reducing in Europe, you can pay for a wind turbine project in China. This actually works. You need, of course, to be very careful of how you do these things, because it might make the price go down too much so that you don't get the positive incentives. The problem right now is that in Europe you have industries saying, and I understand why they're saying it, well, we don't have an international system yet, so if you put these rules in action, then we will just move. So we are creating right now what we call a list of carbon leakage sectors. This process is called carbon leakage when a company or production chooses to move because it's too expensive to produce where there's environment rules. Now, that list is then a list of companies that will get free allowances, sectors that will get free allowances. And right now, that list covers 80% of the European industry. And we've put it in place, and it'll be there until we get a global agreement of some sort. So unless we get a global agreement, it's not going to work.
So really, there are I like what you said. There are really two issues. There's the mitigation issue and the adaptation issue. So maybe it's just to clear our minds. It's clear to say that mitigation means that we've had CO2 emissions being flat for millennia. They recently all gone up. You mentioned it, and the previous speakers mentioned. So we really need a carbon tax, a CO2 tax. It should be about 3 times as high as it is at the moment. So maybe not $13 or $15, maybe more $45, looking at the calculations of Lord Stern's report. And that's the first best thing. That's the thing we need to do. And everything else is second best and third best. So it is because we're not prepared, or we're not unable, from a global point of view, to put on this big tax. Because that will encourage people to be very creative and innovative, to do new technologies, to save, which have less CO2 emissions. Not governments saying it should be that industry or that industry, and then putting too much money in solar, perhaps, or not. We can always debate that. Or saying that we should have nuclear. No, the best thing will work is the price mechanism, and Copenhagen has failed in that sense. That there is an enormous imperative that's been made clear from many studies, also Stern's reports, is that if we don't act now, but if we act 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 15 years' time, or 20 years' time later, it's going to be much more expensive than it is at the moment. So there is an imperative to do it as quick as possible and to get this global agreement. Now, we don't have a global government, and we will never get a global government. But we might have charismatic leaders. So you hope that once Obama gets his health act together, and maybe he will use all his enthusiasm there, and maybe China, because I actually am much more optimistic about China than many other people. So before I quickly say something about adaptation, in Germany, in Berlin, there's this saying called "Erst kommt das Fressen und dann die Moral." So first you have to eat, and then you can worry about morals perspective. I think it's Bertolt Brecht, isn't it? Those of you know. And that really applies to many developing countries. So they first have to get a proper, decent sense of living standards before they can actually get their environmental intellect together. We have something called an environmental Kuznets curve. Many of you have heard it. That as countries develop, they emit more and more emissions, and then as they get richer, slowly they come down and down and down again because they can afford it. So that's erst kommt das Fressen und dann die Moral. So that means that since most of the CO2 damages that have occurred have been done by us, rich countries, by Europe, America, not by the poor countries. Yet all the damages of global warming, most of them occur in the poor countries. So that coming to your point, so that comes us to the adaptation point of view. How do you send Dutch waterwork engineers to build up defenses in developing countries? What do you do about desertification, that more and more things are getting into deserts? They need technological solutions, but they need a lot of money. That's what they call adaptation money. That's really the 0.5% of GDP, what people are talking about. That's something very different from the carbon tax, because that's not the carbon tax. The first thing is the carbon tax. That's what you need to do to be efficient. What Nick Stern says, there's a whacking big missing market. There's no price being charged for pollution. So let's charge that price so that it's socially optimal. Then the second question is just a moral issue, the Bertolt Brecht issue, that since we caused the mess, we have a moral imperative to actually compensate the poorest countries. We're going to get most of the hassle. And 0.5% GDP, I think, I'm not a Catholic, but it strikes me as fairly cheap. And the big danger is, as you say, I see it in my own country, that people trying to cannibalize other development budgets. And that will be very bad. It should be new money. It's not that much. It's a small price to pay for all the rubbish we've caused. And it's a small price to put a little bit our mind at ease for the damages we've done to poorer countries. And until we do that, we cannot hope that China and India were going to be the biggest polluters. They have the biggest number of people. That it really starts, if you want to have a global deal, by putting that on the table as well. So really, why was Copenhagen a failure? It wasn't just China. There was a Chinese thing, that the Asian cultural thing is, of course, you'd never want to lose face. And it was about the monitoring thing. That's, of course, very complicated from a Chinese point of view. But it's also, we failed as Western nations. And so it's really, we need to go up together. And that's really the big for our children and our grandchildren. If we don't get our act together on that, not in the next 10 years, not in the next 15, but in the next 3, 4, 5 years, then it's going to be much more complicated and it'll be a lot more costly. We'll be talking about 0.5%, quickly goes up to 10 or 20% of GDP. And then it's much more complicated.
I very much agreed with what Jan-Erike said in his speech about the assessment of Copenhagen. And I think also that the expectations were far, far too high. At least to me, it was obvious that it wasn't possible to get a legally binding international solution. And the outcome, in my view, could, of course, have been much, much better. But I don't agree with those saying it was a complete failure. Dan already mentioned some positive things which is there in place. Of course, you have to deliver, but that goes to those who have ratified the Kyoto Protocol too. It's binding, but everybody has not delivered anyhow. But I asked for the floor because of China. I'm also much more optimistic than I think people in general are. But first of all, I think the story in Copenhagen was written and conducted by China. Very much. And they succeeded very well also in blaming US for the failure. I think there is a reason to be optimistic concerning China due to domestic policy in China. They will not move because of altruistic reason. They will do a lot because of domestic reasons. People are suffering from polluted air very much. They have to take measures purely because of domestic reasons. I know that they already invest a lot in new green technology, and they have an interest to take the lead in exporting new technology. A lot will happen. So in my view, what should be done waiting for COP16? I think the key players, and they are not very many, should try to reach a political solution. That is China, US, mainly. And EU should be the moderator between those two. If US and China deliver, India will deliver, and also most of the rest. On one point I disagree with Jan. I don't think that the EU promising a lot more will have the good example impact. On the contrary. So EU should not make unconditional solutions. Conditional solutions. I think 20, and if the rest 30 is a good way of proceeding. But the time now from Copenhagen to Mexico should be used by EU mainly to try to get the US and China on the track.
The problem that we are discussing really is very complicated. But personally, I am optimistic about this situation. Why? Maybe this is related with my limited knowledge about the argument, and with my nature as optimistic person. It's personal. However, if you go back, in 1992, for first time was decided in Rio summit to establish a special convention about climate changes. And in that time, very few people have been able to understand why. After that, in 2002, have been organized the summit of Johannesburg. And there were asked that to think globally and to act locally. For that time have been very good. First of all, that was asked to think globally. And now we are in quite new situation. Quite new. Really, the danger exists over the planet, but we are more prepared to undertake actions we need. 2 months ago, the summit of Copenhagen maybe was not so successful, but personally I think that was an important step ahead. What I would like to say now. In respect of climate changes and with contributors of greenhouse gas emissions, we know that the richest countries are the main contributors. But here is not balance between the countries which are the biggest contributors for greenhouse gas emissions and the countries who are, or let's say, of distribution of consequences. Has not any positive correlation between these two questions. Has a big difference. An Albanian. Albania is a small country with 4.3 million people. It's a developing country. But fortunately, we belong to a geographical position that will suffer much less from the climate changes than other countries that are in Africa, for example. But we pay, and because we are not so developed. So the question is, who will pay? Sure, all the participants and all the leaders and governments accept that the richest countries has to pay. And this is decided, even in Copenhagen, for adaptation, for mitigation, altogether 130 billion US dollars, if I'm not wrong. But is enough? I think that is not enough. It's much less that we have to do, because as what is what mentioned, if we pay, if we not pay €1 today, or 1 million euro, or 1 billion euro, or 1 trillion euro, we have to pay for this 10 or 20 years after 50 or much more billion euros. So we have to pay now, we have to invest now. And for this, I think that we have to change a little bit the philosophy from to think globally and to act locally, to think globally and to act globally. But right now, for me, this is very important. And now another thing. If we classify, we have 3 types of energy resources. One is traditional, let's say. The second is renewable energy, except big hydro energy, but small, wind and solar and so on. And maybe we can classify as a third kind of energy, nuclear energy. Between 3 kinds of energy, we have to put one balance, or to have one opinion how to go ahead. we are discussing now in Albania to construct or not to construct one nuclear power plant, because has such ideas there. And however, in my opinion, is that we have to invest much more now for wind energy, for solar energy, which are, let's say, forever, and are friendly with environment. This is my opinion for this question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to take this down from the macro level to the micro level now. And Professor Pant yesterday was in the minority of one, I sensed for some time. But there was one thing he said which struck me as very interesting. He said we should bring everything down to the local level. And he's very skeptical of globalization. And it set me thinking, is not climate change and maybe the solution to climate change that we need to maybe concentrate not on trying to cut emissions of transport, but we need to get down to local produce, local factories, and away from an idea that maybe the answer is more globalization, more global economy, so that we can pay for the pollution that this causes. I'd like to maybe pass it over to maybe the economists amongst us here.
Yes, but sure. I don't exclude local action. No, sure. Finally, we have to act as national countries and specific countries, but to think and to organize our ideas, we need to have a global program.
Okay, of course, we always act locally. I'm always in one place, so that's true. And I think your question was a different one. There is always this fantasy or this ideal. Well, let's just only consume local products. I mean, in Britain there's a big tradition for that. So you only buy produce from London, for example, is where I live, or from Oxford, and then you don't have to have these horrible aeroplanes and all these big boats to ship it in and out, and then you avoid a lot of CO2 emissions. Well, there's a lot to be said about that. I mean, of course, in terms of dreams and ideals, this sounds quite nice, but first economically, that may turn out to be very inefficient, because a lot of international trade has made people a lot happier, has led to a lot more competition, has kept costs down. Secondly, it's not clear. The studies I've seen, but others may be better informed than me, but the studies I've seen have shown that local produce is not always more CO2 or more environmental friendly, because the stuff for international trade is shipped in very large bulk. Actually, the emissions per unit of produce is actually not that bad. Of course, if you put up this carbon price, say from 15 to 45 euros per ton or whatever, then of course there'll be a lot more saving going on, and some of that will happen anyway. But then it'll be done in a way which is actually directed by the market. I'm a social democrat, like the young man next to me. But I mean, but I think we should use the market, harness the market, to solve the environmental problem. And then yes, maybe some forms of international trade will become no longer profitable, and then they'll stop. But on the whole, most of welfare in society, and don't forget that enormous increase in wealth that's happening now in India, and in Southeast Asia, China, is because they have become part of the international trading system. The forgotten continent is, of course, Africa. There too little is happening. But as soon as they can take part in the international trading system in a better way, a lot of people will be lifted out of poverty there as well. So I'm very, although as an ideal, I like it, I would warn against. And maybe that's what distinguishes, if I may say so, maybe social democrats from Greens on the whole, although I'm a fully paid up member of Greenpeace. So.
Well, to come back to a main theme here, I totally agree with the basic idea of a carbon tax. That's a very rational idea and a good idea. It's an economist's good idea, and I share it. But in this area you find some nations that are very, very irrational. First of all, United States. I mean, United States could solve a lot of their problems if they would introduce just a modest tax on gas. Modest tax per gallon of gas would have very fine consequences for the American economy. First of all, it would help them reduce their debts, their deficits. Secondly, it would inspire energy savings, which they need in many respects. But they don't do it. For political reasons, this is a non-starter until now, at least in the US, even if it is highly rational. And therefore, it's not coming about for the time being, but that it's a very good idea is undisputable. Now, it was said that by our Dutch friend from, I cannot pronounce your last name. Rick, okay, Rick, this I can pronounce, that he was more optimistic about China. So am I. I think we have seen over the last many years now that when China commits itself to certain policies, they stick to it. They do it. They just don't say it. They do it. They implement. They have plans and they implement, and they do so sometimes ruthlessly, but they implement their own plans, and they have plans for investing in green solutions. As it was said, in the interest of their own people, yes, but they also realize, and I'm sure they do so, that this will be a major inspiration for economic growth in the future. And that's why I think we could expect the Chinese to deliver in a number of areas. In a couple of years' time, we will have to compete with them in green technologies. Now, exactly the same reasoning applies to Europe. And here I may introduce a little bit of a Nordic disagreement. I think the EU would do itself a lot of good by setting higher standards for itself for reduction of emissions, for example, and not wait for the others. Exactly the same argument that goes to the Chinese would go for Europe. That would inspire technological innovation, and it would be good for our citizens. Citizens are ready to pay for a better environment, at least in my country. So why not let Europe also take better steps now? I don't see any reasons to hesitate.
We don't want to answer back to Nordic disagreement. Is that very rare thing? Or?
Well, I think EU really does a lot, and every single member country in EU delivers. My main point is that I don't believe that there is a positive effect of a promising unconditionally a lot more. Conditionally, yes.
I'm not from a Nordic country, so I just think, just because to liven up, I disagree extremely strongly with you. I'll speak for my own country, because then be rude, but I can do the same story for other countries. I think Holland, the Netherlands, fails miserably in doing a proper environmental policy. It shows up in the type of electricity generators they're still building. It shows up in the fact that we still haven't got a proper carbon tax. We still haven't got policies to get down traffic down to a normal road. The government is basically scared stiff of anything environmental because it'll be on the front of the populist newspapers in big chocolate letters. And they basically too scared stiff to actually pursue this ambitious environmental policy, which is this first mover advantage you might create, and also, which is a typically Dutch thing, a typical Nordic thing. I wish it was true. It is true on the trading agreement, on the ETS, but on the otherwise, if you just look in the political practice, actually, I'm not that positive. But I'm exaggerating a bit because it's just before lunch, but not that much.
Well, let's take an example from the real world. Did EU promise of decreasing emissions by 20% have any effect of the outcome of the COP15? I don't think so.
Now, can I just make one short point then? That raises this discussion to a different level. You cannot negotiate with nature. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if this was the best we could achieve. It doesn't matter if it's a good strategy. If we don't reduce with at least between 25 and 40% in 2020, we will go below 2 degrees, above 2 degrees. If that happens, then it doesn't matter what we do, because then all the self-enhancing mechanisms will set in. So if we, who are the leaders in the world, don't even ourselves promise more than 20%, then there's no way that this can be done. No way that this can be done. This is also why I have to say that I agree with Niels on almost everything always, but I disagree with you that we had too high expectation of Copenhagen. If anything, I think we had too low. Science tells us we need to change within 5 years. We have 5 years to act. It's almost impossible, and if we were to achieve it, we should have had an agreement in Copenhagen. Now I'm saying, because if I don't say that, I might as well just lie down in the emperor position and cry. I'm saying we still have a chance, even though it's so small, but let's go for it. We cannot say, let's see how we can agree and how the negotiations go. No, because you cannot negotiate with nature.
I think we have two different subjects being discussed in the same time. First, the international negotiation process. And it's not a question of, it's not a technical issue. It's a question of confidence, of political mandate, and political in the higher expectation of these words. What are we going to do together in the next decade, century, millennium on this planet? It's a question of the future of civilization. Second, and there I'm more optimistic than pessimistic. I think I agree that China can do, is doing already a lot about these questions because of its own interest and also because of its will to have and develop relationships with some developing countries because of other difficulties in the field, for example, of land farming and land use. And so I want also to notice, and it's not pessimistic, it's a fact, the failure of the multilateral frame, because the powerful countries don't need this multilateral frame to act and to do a lot on their own decision. And so does China for the moment, so does United States, so do United States, so does Europe. And this failure, we can notice it also in the frame of World Trade Organization. It's as it is easy for United States and China to discuss together and to suggest in the last minutes of a negotiation a text and saying it's the basis of we suggest you to close the discussions. So does Brazil and do Brazil and United States in the field of agriculture in the World Trade Organization. They don't need the multilateral frame. But I think we can, I'm optimistic because I'm convinced that we can do a lot in the frame of the agreements being already discussed. In Kyoto, we said we have common but differentiated responsibilities. We want the big emitters to take legally binding, quantified commitments with a regime of compliance and observance and sanctions. And there was a third part, policies and measures, national or coordinated on the international level. And we did not do a lot in this field. And there is something new for adaptation, mitigation, or for energy efficiency. There is something new. We have the money now, if we believe the promises made in Copenhagen, 30 billion for fast start, 500 billion till 2020, and we don't need more. We don't need, for the moment, the negotiation process to go on too fast, if we can't. But we know perfectly how to use this money for isolating of houses, for public transportation in the big cities, between the cities, for modernization of industries in the southern countries, and so on and so on. And so we need concrete action plans to use this money, additional money, of course. It's not naive to say that, but of course we should not allow the international communities to stop acting till the negotiation process is totally convincing after the Copenhagen semi-failure.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring the audience into the debate, but before I do, so hold your hands a minute. I'd like to give the last word really to the ambassador, because you will be, I believe, maybe negotiating again as you were in Copenhagen. You will be a representative. You're a chief negotiator. I'd like to ask you sort of briefly: are you optimistic about Mexico, and also what you would like there to be concretely and functionally different this time than how it was organized in Copenhagen? How you would bring about a positive result?
First of all, I'm optimistic. That's how I'm optimistic about things. Real optimistic. If I were not optimistic, I would not be here, and I would not even negotiate. That is so. For Lesotho and least developing countries, we're optimistic that countries have got a political will and a will to address climate change, and that they will do their utmost best to come up with a legally binding agreement that is ambitious, that is fair, that realizes the importance of acting now, because the cost of inaction is much more than the cost of action. That is fundamental, and consequently, I believe that they know this, and they are willing to address it. Now, on the other hand, historically, we have found out that it is not always the case. It doesn't always, it's not always that A leads to B and C to D as, logic, because there are differences of that play. Economics is one of them. Certain interests are there, for whatever reasons, that we don't know about. Promises have been made, but never been fulfilled. This is another dilemma. So even the question of, fast-track money that has come up, we're very, very, scared whether this money in actual fact is going to come. And I can tell you, I don't believe the money is going to come, honestly. I'm skeptical. Even if it does come, and there have been permission that this money should be under the auspice of the World Bank. Now, God forbid if it's going to be managed by the World Bank, you can forget it. So, yes, and that's terrible. And we are saying, if this money, it should be within the existing framework, within the UNFCCC, and the mechanism of accessing this money should be made, much more flexible, and, make sure that there is a mechanism of making sure that it does address issues for developing countries, at least for LDCs, for adaptation. The technology is there. We want this technology transfer to happen. Most of these countries in LDCs do not have even the adaptive capacity, to adapt to climate change. They don't have it. We need technology to have, those countries to support us, and genuinely support us, so that we can be able to adapt to climate change, because they are the ones that are most vulnerable and most affected. For us, for developing countries, it's a matter of life and death. Countries, some countries, we don't even talk now about emerging economies. We are talking about submerging countries, This is the worst thing. So, I'm optimistic. I'm hoping that the EU will take the lead to make sure that they bring the United States on board. But even if they don't, it's not a matter of saying that because the United States does not come on board, that the EU should then say, well, we'll keep our targets at 20%. No, that is the wrong way. if they're convinced, they should say, well, we'll stick up to 35% greenhouse gas emissions and 40, irrespective of what you guys are saying, because science says so. Then the other countries will follow. And I'm clear that China will follow. They're taking the lead. They're looking at the queue. They've got nothing. They will internationalize their internal greenhouse gas emissions, programs. They will. They just want. They're just waiting. They're just saying. In fact, they're laughing at the whole debate that I'm hoping, because they know that, and as you rightly say, they have to do it. They have to do it. They will lead in the greenhouse technologies. They're leading already in the solar. They'll do everything else in their best interest, despite the problems that they're having. So I'm hoping that with Denmark should be playing a big role now in making sure that meetings are happening, within the process, so that by end of May, during the conference in Copenhagen, in March, they have teased out some of these things and made sure that the EU plays a much more significant role in driving the process, so that really in Mexico we should reach an agreement, a binding legal agreement, binding agreement that is genuine, that is fair, that addresses, and that money is going to be put to address climate change. If that does not happen, it will be a pity, but I'm optimistic that it will happen.